Hello and welcome to our webinar today, Document Migration to Alfresco, Best Practices. I have with me Tony Parsnot from Technology Services Group, who will have our presentation today. Tony?
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everyone. As Melissa mentioned, I'm Tony Parsnot. I'm a technical architect at Technology Services Group. I'm also the product manager for our Open Migrate solution that I'm going to be talking through and demonstrating today. Just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'll start with just a quick overview of TSG, and I'll talk about our Open Migrate solution. I'll dive into migration methodology and share some of our expertise in doing migrations from Documentum to Alfresco. I'll talk about various migration approaches and some specific things to keep in mind when you're planning a migration from Documentum to Alfresco. And kind of riddled throughout the presentation, I'll cut over and do some demos to show you how the process works. So Technology Services Group is a consulting firm. We were founded in 1996, and we're based in Chicago, Illinois. We specialize solely in implementing ECM solutions across various industries, including life sciences, financial services, manufacturing, insurance, engineering. We've been a Documentum integrator since our founding in 1996. And internally, we've developed various software offerings based on best practices that we've uncovered in our years of experience in ECM. Alfresco, TSG has actually been an Alfresco partner. We were one of the first Alfresco partners in 2006. And since then, we've won various awards from Alfresco. In 2012, we received Implementation of the Year for our work with the New York Philharmonic, which is actually a fairly large migration project. In 2013, we won the award for Alfresco's fastest growing partner in the US, and last year in 2014, we were Partner of the Year. So I mentioned some of our solutions that we offer that work with Alfresco. We have HPI, which is a high-performance interface. It's a streamlined interface for document management, kind of an alternative to Alfresco Share. We have our Active Wizard solution, which is a dynamic forms and workflow tool. Open Overlay provides the ability to add watermarking and stamping to PDF documents. Open Annotate, which I'll touch on briefly today, is a web-based annotation tool for documents. And finally, Open Migrate is our migration solution for moving documents from a source to a target repository. A little bit more about Open Migrate. As I mentioned, it's a high-performance migration tool. It's useful for one-time or ongoing migrations. It's built on a completely Java-based framework that's made up of highly configurable and extendable components that can be interchanged. Along with Open Migrate comes a proven methodology that's developed to assist clients in the migration of their content between two different locations. Open Migrate's been continuously in development at TSG since 2006. We're always enhancing the product and adding additional connectors. It's a widely used solution with more than 25,000 downloads from our website in the past 5 years, which amounts to billions of documents being migrated with Open Migrate. So Open Migrate can be configured to work with various source and target systems, but across the board, Open Migrate supports standard ECM migration requirements, so various document types, supports the mapping of metadata or attributes from source to target systems, supports migration of folder structure, content and renditions. It can support migration of previous versions of content, Lifecycle, and others as well. So here's a list of the various sources and targets that are available for Open Migrate, and there's constantly additions and enhancements to these various sources and targets. So on the source side, we're able to migrate out of Documentum, obviously. We can migrate from Alfresco, FileNet, File System, Hummingbird, OpenText, QMOS, Canon ImageWare, Stellent, App Extender. Pretty much any repository with a database and file system behind it, we can develop connectors to migrate content out of. On the target side, we have full-featured targets for migrating to Documentum and Alfresco, to a file system, to Solar, and to SharePoint. Here's a quick diagram of the type of migration that I'm going to be demonstrating today, basically moving from a legacy Documentum repository into Alfresco. So you see on the left-hand side, we have Documentum, which is backed by a database and file system as the Open Migrate source, and the target is Alfresco, which is also backed by a database and file system. Just a quick note on some of the architecture features of Open Migrate. It's a completely Java-based command line utility, and it's platform agnostic. So Open Migrate will run on virtually any operating system that supports Java. And the source and target connectors of Open Migrate are completely independent. And Open Migrate uses native Java connectivity APIs to connect to both source and target systems. And I'll talk a little bit about that in respect to Documentum and Alfresco in a few slides later. Open Migrate is heavily configurable, utilizes streamlined properties files and XML files for its configuration. We use dependency injection using the Spring framework, and the source and target components are interchangeable. Open Migrate is a multi-threaded system, so it provides high throughput in migrating large amounts of content from the source to the target system. Here's a quick diagram of what Open Migrate looks like, a little bit under the hood. Basically, we have a migration engine and pipeline that manage the entire migration process. The first thing that happens when Open Migrate is started is a queue populator runs. And what the queue populator does is basically create a to-do list, so a list of all the items that need to be migrated from the source to the target. Normally on the Documentum side, we would populate a queue using a DQL query or DQL against the Documentum repository to form a list of IDs of objects that we need to migrate. Once the queue is populated, the source takes over and pulls the content out of the source system. And then the items move through a mapping layer, which allow us to transform any of the metadata prior to uploading the content into the target system. From there, we moved into the target adapter. In the case today, I'll be showing the Documentum or the Alfresco target. And finally, the entire process has a sophisticated logging mechanism that will tell you exactly what was migrated, if it was successful, and any other information, metadata as well. So a little bit about our Documentum source connector. We use the native Documentum Foundation classes, or DFC, API to extract metadata and content from Documentum. We support most of the recent versions of Documentum, starting back with Documentum 4 all the way up through Documentum 7. And our source connector supports migration of related Documentum artifacts, so it's not just the documents themselves, but we can migrate versions, folder structure, renditions, annotations, Audit Trail, ACLs, and users and groups out of Documentum. On the Alfresco side, we actually have 3 options for a target connector for Alfresco, depending on the type of system and the type of migration that you're wanting to execute. So we have a migration target connector for Alfresco that utilizes the legacy SOAP Web Services API. This would be for migrating into Alfresco versions 3.x and lower. For newer versions of Alfresco, we have a CMIS target connector for Alfresco. Again, as I mentioned, that's for versions of Alfresco that are 4 and higher. We also have the ability to embed Open Migrate as a subsystem within Alfresco. This is a typical use case in scenarios where we want to perform ongoing migrations on a scheduled basis. So for example, if we're wanting to watch a folder using Open Migrate, and anytime new content comes into that folder, if we want to import it into Alfresco, the embedded target solution is very useful for that. A little bit about the mapping capabilities of Open Migrate. So between the source and target, we have a mapping layer, and its function is to map attribute values from the source to the target system. And there's various approaches we can take with the mapping. So this is metadata. Metadata can be mapped directly from one object in the source to the target. We can map indirectly from one attribute in the source system to a different attribute in the target system. We can perform various transformations on the metadata within the mapping layer. For example, if we wanted to change a particular property to be in all capital letters, we have transformers that are able to do that very easily. We can also use the mapping layer to set default values for attributes in the target system. So our mapping layer finally can be used to restructure the folder structure between the source and target systems. So if in Documentum you have a folder structure that's not working or not exactly how you want it to be in the target system, the Open Migrate mapping layer can very easily be used to remap the content to different folders within the target system. Open Migrate has a concept of listeners, and listeners perform specific tasks at a given point during the migration. This adds the ability to perform more complex data manipulation at any point within the migration process. So some examples of this, if you needed to look up the employee ID of the owner of a document in PeopleSoft as part of your migration so that you can store that employee ID as metadata in Alfresco, you can use a listener to do that. We've also used listeners in the past to add watermarking or overlays to PDF documents as they're being migrated. So those are just a couple of examples. There's a lot of ways to use listeners in Open Migrate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the typical migration methodology. So everything that needs to happen in order to get your content out of Documentum and into Alfresco. And there's 5 typical phases that we would go through. The first and most important being the planning phase, where you'd identify what content needs to migrate, when you're going to migrate it, and how you're going to migrate it. After the planning is complete, you can move on to configuring Open Migrate so that it's able to migrate the content from your Documentum system to Alfresco, as well as configure Alfresco to accept the new content. Typically, Alfresco would need to be configured with your custom content model or any other artifacts that you need to map from Documentum prior to your migration. The third phase is the testing phase, very important to run your migration in a test environment to confirm that all of your objects are being migrated as expected. That includes, verifying the metadata and the content, renditions, anything else that you're migrating out of Documentum. It's also important during the testing phase to test on a large enough set of data that you'll be able to get an idea for the amount of time it's going to take to do your full production migration. Once your testing is complete, you move on to the actual production migration phase, where you execute the Documentum to Alfresco migration in production. And finally, after the migration is complete, there would be some verification required to make sure that all the content was moved successfully from Documentum into Alfresco. So the typical timeline actually for a migration, as we've seen it over the years, is maybe a little bit surprising that the planning phase is the longest phase. At this point, identifying what needs to migrate, determining the timeline and how everything's going to happen is really the most time-consuming part of the migration process. Typically, the configuration, testing, migration, and verification move along much more quickly. So we're going to focus on the planning phase in today's presentation. And during planning, this is where it really helps, if needed, to bring in experts who know the ins and outs of both Documentum and Alfresco to help out with the planning. Consultants at TSG have years of experience with this and setting up these types of migrations with Open Migrate. So quickly, before I move into various migration approaches, I'm going to kick off a migration sample from Documentum into Alfresco. So on my screen right now actually is Documentum WebTop. I'm going to go ahead and log in. So here within WebTop, this is just a test system that I have some various pieces of content in. What my sample migration is going to do is take this standard operating procedures cabinet and migrate it and all of its contents over into an Alfresco target system. So you'll see here within the standard operating procedures, I have a folder structure and various documents within each one of these folders. Most of these are Word documents, and we can see that there's some metadata applied. Aside from just the name of the documents, we have a title. All that metadata will be mapped over into the Alfresco target system. Before I kick off the migration, I'm going to log into the target Alfresco system. And I'll look in the repository. So right now you see here there is no standard operating procedures folder. That's actually going to be created and brought over using Open Migrate from Documentum. So right now there's nothing in my Alfresco system. I mentioned previously that Open Migrate is a command line utility. It's actually not all that interesting to watch as it's running, so I'm just going to kick that off and then go back to my slides and then show the results. But I've already configured Open Migrate to move that standard operating procedures cabinet and its contents, so I'm just going to fire it off right now. It starts running. Everything gets logged into the console, so I'll let that run and return to my presentation to talk about some migration approaches. So the approaches that I'm going to talk about are going to be the Big Bang migration approach. I'll talk about delta migrations, gradual migrations, and rolling migrations. Starting off with the Big Bang, and this is usually where people's minds go when they first think about migration, is that all at once we're going to move all of our content out of Documentum into Alfresco, and once that's done, then everybody's going to start using Alfresco immediately all at once. So there's a picture on the screen. Basically, the way you start out is you have all of your users in Documentum, all of your contents in Documentum, and Alfresco is not being used. Once the migration starts, basically the users lose all access to the Documentum repository. So basically the system is down during a Big Bang migration, and Open Migrate starts up and we begin moving all the content into Alfresco. After some time, the content has all been moved into Alfresco, and then we can then get our users working against the Alfresco repository, and we can decommission the Documentum system. So some advantages and disadvantages of the Big Bang approach. Advantages, Documentum in this case can be immediately decommissioned as soon as the migration is complete. And the migration only has to be planned, configured, tested, and executed one time. So some major drawbacks of this type of migration approach is that it can require a significant amount of downtime, and sometimes this downtime would be unacceptable if we're talking about business critical systems while the migration is actually happening. So the timing really is going to depend on the amount of content that you have in your repository, but potentially for millions or billions of documents, the migration could take a long time to run. The Big Bang approach is also the highest risk. If anything goes wrong during the migration, basically you have to roll back and start over. The Big Bang migration also tends to have the highest chance of exceeding timeline and budget because you're basically you're starting with unknowns and you're trying to do everything all in one fell swoop. And everything must move. Everyone within the system, and other disadvantages, all your users have to move from Documentum to Alfresco, and everyone has to be trained all at once. So there's a lot going on all at one time. All right, so I think my migration should be finished up now. So I'll go into Alfresco now and show that once I refresh, I now have a standard operating procedures high-level folder in Alfresco. Once I click into here, I see the folder structure that was in Documentum has now been migrated and replicated into Alfresco. As I click on individual folders, I see that the Word documents from the source system have been migrated, obviously with their metadata as well. So I see the titles. If I click on an individual document, Alfresco will generate a preview for me to show that the content was actually moved. And here I can see some of the additional metadata fields that were migrated as part of the Documentum to Alfresco migration. One important thing to notice here is actually we're able to preserve the creation and modify dates from Documentum. So these dates, as you can see, are dates in the past because we have special connectors for Alfresco that let us preserve that metadata from Documentum. So now I'll move on to another approach for doing migrations, and in this case, this approach is called a delta migration. Basically, it's similar to the Big Bang approach, except you're doing an initial bulk migration from Documentum to Alfresco, but while that migration is happening, Documentum is staying turned on and is still available for users to use. So users can still change content, add content as they please while the migration is running. And then once the bulk migration is finished and before the cutover to Alfresco, we would run another second migration that will sync up the changes that have happened between when the initial migration was started and finished. So my picture here, obviously you start out with with everyone in Documentum. Open Migrate starts running, but Documentum is still available to users. Content is being moved into Alfresco. Nobody's using Alfresco yet. This little red box that I have here is signifying a change that somebody has made to content within Documentum while the migration is running. So once that initial bulk migration is complete, we perform what's called the delta migration. So this is just migrating any content that's changed since the bulk migration. At this point during the delta migration, the users need to be cut off from Documentum, and they should not be able to change anything in the system while the delta migration is running, but the delta migration is usually a small subset of content and runs fairly quickly to minimize your downtime. Once the delta migration is complete and everything's moved into Alfresco, then your users can begin using Alfresco. So some of the advantages of a delta migration is that large portions of the migration can be completed while the users are still in Documentum. The delta migration of changes is generally small and minimizes your downtime. And the migration and new environment can be proven out and verified prior to the cutover. Some of the disadvantages of a delta migration is that all of your users still need to be trained on Alfresco and move over to Alfresco all in one fell swoop. And additional verification is needed to ensure that the delta migration was successful after it's run. So quickly, I'm going to go back to another demo. Basically, I'm going to demo a delta migration. I'm going to come into Documentum and just make a couple of changes. So I've already run my bulk migration, which you saw in the first demo. So here, I'm just going to change some metadata, change this title to be updated, and I'll go ahead and import a new document as well. I'm importing into WebTop. And now you see back in my folder I have this new document. So now I'm going to go ahead and use Open Migrate and kick off a delta migration. Since this one is a shorter one, we'll actually just watch the console here and wait for this one to run. So basically with Open Migrate, as it's starting up, it takes a little bit of time to connect to the source and target repositories. It populates the queue, and then immediately begins moving content from the source to the target system. Once it's complete, it reports out what has been migrated. So in our case, 2 pieces of the content were migrated. So the document that I modified and the document that I created new were migrated into Alfresco. When I come back over into Alfresco, I'll refresh the screen here. You'll see the metadata change that I made. The title here is now in Alfresco, and the new document, number 15, is now in Alfresco as well. So that's a quick demo of a delta migration. And oftentimes, actually, our clients use this delta migration approach to run ongoing migrations. So a migration doesn't have to happen all at once or in one fell swoop. You can schedule open migrate. So if multiple delta migrations need to happen while users stay in Documentum and before moving to Alfresco, you can configure delta migrations to be more than a one-time thing. So the next migration approach I'm going to talk about is a gradual migration. So in this case, departments or subsets of users are going to be migrated with their content individually in phases to the Alfresco system. And then eventually Documentum will be decommissioned after all the departments and users have been moved. So my picture moves here. We start off again with everyone in Documentum. We basically turn off one set of users or departments, cut them off from Documentum, and migrate their content into Alfresco during a first phase. Once that migration is complete, those users can begin using Alfresco. Meanwhile, the other departments are still on Documentum. And then sometime down the road, we start phase 2 of the migration, and another department is cut off from Documentum. We migrate their content, and then they're able to begin using Alfresco. And then finally, our last department in a third phase, we would cut them off from Documentum, migrate their content, and then at that point, everyone is on Alfresco, and we can decommission Documentum. So some advantages of the gradual migration is it's less risky because departments can move on their own timelines. You're not having to coordinate everyone within your organization moving all at once. You can bite off small pieces. And your departments or subsets of users can be trained on Alfresco individually, and they can be trained specifically on what they need to be trained on. The needs of one department might be different from the needs of another department. And Alfresco and other system resources can be tuned gradually as the content is brought into the system rather than having to size Alfresco all at once. Some disadvantages of the gradual migration is the timeline can be extended to last months or years. So with the Big Bang approach, it's kind of all at once, but the gradual migration can definitely take some time. It takes additional effort to plan, configure, test, migrate, and verify multiple times. And Documentum, in this case, cannot be immediately decommissioned. You can't decommission Documentum until all of your departments have moved to Alfresco. A quick note, these different approaches for migration are not mutually exclusive. A lot of times we see our clients combining one approach with another. A good approach in our minds is to combine a gradual migration with a delta. So we would recommend that you perform several migrations for sets of users or departments, and also utilize the ability to do delta migration so that you're minimizing the downtime for those departments as they're moving. So this helps to mitigate any risks as you move to the new system and new hardware. It also allows you to slowly and gradually move users to the new system. One final migration approach that I'm going to talk about is a rolling migration. And with a rolling migration, users can begin using the Alfresco system immediately, and the content actually gets migrated from Documentum to Alfresco with Open Migrate on demand as the content is being requested by the users within Alfresco. So here, all of our users immediately begin using Alfresco, and as the users are working within the system and requesting content, the content on demand gets brought over. So as I move through here, eventually the content all comes over from Documentum. So some advantages and disadvantages of a rolling migration. On the plus side, all users can immediately take advantage of the new features of your Alfresco system. There's no downtime necessary for any bulk or delta migrations as you move from one system to the next. And content is migrated as needed, making it easy to identify content in your legacy Documentum system that's no longer being used. Some of the disadvantages of a rolling migration is that it requires custom user interfaces that are smart enough to know when to initiate a migration of content from the legacy Documentum system. Again, in this case, we're not able to immediately decommission Documentum, and eventually there may still be a need to perform a bulk migration from Documentum to Alfresco for any content that's still remaining in Documentum that hasn't been used by users in a long time. So those are some migration approaches. Now I'm going to cut over and talk a little bit about the scope of migrations. So when you're thinking about performing migration, it's not just the content that you're moving from Documentum to Alfresco, but you also need to think about, are you moving everything or just a subset of your content? And then in addition to that, are you moving additional related objects from Documentum? Do you need to move versions, renditions, annotations, folder structure? And then you also need to think about how much content you're going to be moving, and this will determine how long your migration is actually going to take. So you need to consider not only the total number of documents that you're moving, but also the size of those documents, because it's going to take longer to move 1 million large files than it's going to take to move smaller files. So now I'll discuss some Documentum concepts and how those concepts relate to a migration to an Alfresco system. Beginning with object types, obviously Documentum has a hierarchical structure of object types, and Alfresco has a very similar concept. Some recommendations and things to keep in mind is that when you're creating your content model, you need to create and deploy the content model that you're migrating to in Alfresco prior to starting your migration. You can utilize Open Migrate and its mapping capabilities to map attributes from Documentum into Alfresco. And we also recommend the concept of aspects within Alfresco is very powerful, and we recommend that if you're obviously redoing your content model anyway, that you take advantage of the aspect features that are available in Alfresco. I touched on this in my demo, but you can use Open Migrate to preserve properties that are part of the auditable aspect within Alfresco when moving from Documentum. So Open Migrate has a connector that will preserve the creation date, creator name, modify date, and modifier. And we're able to do this using a custom web script that we call from Open Migrate while the migration is running. Moving on to folders, you saw this in the demo as well, but Open Migrate fully supports migrating folder structures from Documentum to Alfresco. Some recommendations here, the folder structure can be migrated as is if it's working well in your Documentum system and you just want to map it over as is into Alfresco. You can also use the Open Migrate mapping layer to reorganize your content into a different folder structure if desired. So if your current folder structure is a mess and is not working well, a migration is a good time to clean up and reorganize your folder structure. If your folders have custom metadata, you can actually set up a separate migration using Open Migrate to migrate the folder structure from Documentum to Alfresco prior to running your migration that'll migrate the content. And Alfresco does not have the concept of cabinets built within it, but basically a cabinet in Documentum is just a top-level folder. So our recommendation is in Alfresco to just use folders. Open Migrate is able to support migration of previous versions from Documentum to Alfresco. One of the advantages here, Open Migrate migrates the entire version tree as a single transaction. So if something happens or goes wrong during the migration of a particular version of a document, the entire version tree gets failed and reported back to you running the migration, so you're not left with an incomplete version structure within your Alfresco target system. Also be aware that within Documentum, there is a concept of branched versions that we very rarely see any of our clients using, but if you are using branched versions in Documentum, that concept is not supported in Alfresco, so you will need to plan accordingly for your branch versioning and how you want to migrate that into Alfresco. renditions. So basically a rendition is just a different format of a piece of content, obviously supported by both Documentum and Alfresco. Open Migrate supports the extraction of multiple renditions from Documentum. Our recommendation with renditions, actually, you can use Open Migrate to migrate those renditions into Alfresco directly, or sometimes it's a good idea to actually use, just migrate the native rendition of your content and then let Alfresco transform that content using the built-in transformers within Alfresco. Oftentimes we see the Alfresco transformations being higher quality because they're using more recent and modern tools to actually generate the renditions. And also, it will also make your repository more consistent because all of your renditions will have been generated by Alfresco rather than having some of them moved from Documentum and some of them for your new content generated by Alfresco. Annotations is actually often a sticking point that we've heard recently within Documentum because for those familiar with Documentum, Documentum has a tool called PDF Annotation Services, which allows you to add markup to documents using the Adobe XFDF commenting standard for PDFs. Unfortunately, PDF Annotation Services is no longer supported by Documentum as of Documentum 6.7. So there's actually no alternative that's available right now in Documentum to continue using this service. But luckily, TSG has an open source annotation tool called Open Annotate that is platform independent, and it's an alternative to Documentum PDF annotation services. And so you can use Open Migrate to migrate your annotations from Documentum into Alfresco, and then you can use Open Annotate within Alfresco to continue to modify, view, and edit those annotations that were created in Documentum. Open Annotate can also be used with Alfresco Share and other interfaces to create annotations on new content going forward. So Open Annotate is a pretty good alternative to the existing PDF annotation tool that's available within Documentum. I'm going to go ahead and show a quick demo of annotations since I have this set up already within my Documentum system. So right now I'm back in Documentum WebTop, and I'll go ahead and add some annotations to a document. I have the PDF Annotation Services client enabled. You'll see in Documentum actually the system utilizes Adobe Reader or Adobe Acrobat to apply the annotations, so I do have to have that client installed on my browser in order to do this, but I'll just go ahead and add a couple of sticky notes here to my document, and I'll do some highlighting as well. I'll just find some text and highlight it in yellow and save those changes back into the Documentum repository. Once that's done, I'll return to WebTop. And then basically here, because I've already run my bulk migration, I just added some annotations. I'm just going to run another quick delta migration using Open Migrate. And this will, Open Migrate will recognize that my document has changed, or annotations have been added, and it'll remigrate this content into Alfresco with the annotations. All right, so this will take just a second to complete. All right, you'll see that one document was migrated successfully, and that was the one that I added annotations to. I'll come back into Alfresco and refresh my screen here. My Alfresco Share instance already has the Open Annotate plugin installed into it. So here I'll just show how those annotations have been migrated into Alfresco. So I have an Open Annotate action here available on the content that I annotated. Once I click on that, Open Annotate Viewer is loaded. One nice thing about Open Annotate is that it does not require Adobe Acrobat or Adobe Reader. It's completely browser-based, and you'll see that the annotations that I added in Documentum have been successfully migrated to to Alfresco. And if I wanted to here, I could utilize Open Annotate. I can start adding additional annotations, highlighting anything that I wanted to do, and then save those annotations back into Alfresco. So now moving on to other Documentum concepts, security. So security on content is implemented a little bit differently between Documentum and Alfresco. So it's definitely something to think about during the planning stages of your migration, or how you're going to handle your security once you move to Alfresco. So Documentum has ACLs that get applied to every object within the repository. In Alfresco, permissions are implemented a little bit differently, where the permissions are applied directly to individual documents or folders. And Alfresco also has the ability for content to inherit permissions from the folder that the content lives in. Our recommendation from a security perspective is to evaluate your security structure as it exists in Documentum to gauge its complexity. And then based on that evaluation, you can either migrate or set up your existing security structure in Alfresco prior to your migration, or you can leverage the power of the security inheritance from folders within Alfresco and just migrate your content in and have all of your items just inherit permissions from the parent folders. Another concept commonly used in Documentum is this concept of document lifecycle. Alfresco doesn't have native support for a lifecycle feature. However, Alfresco, you can very easily implement features that Documentum lifecycle has using behaviors in Alfresco. So an example of a behavior that you might set up in Alfresco is when the status attribute of a document changes, you might want to set, or when the status changes to approved, you might want to set the approval date on the document to be the current date and time. This type of functionality is very easy to implement within an Alfresco behavior. So oftentimes, something we think about when doing a migration from Documentum to Alfresco when we have lifecycles involved is just implementing any of those lifecycle features in Alfresco behaviors. Another thing to think about is Audit Trail. Open Migrate can actually extract Audit Trail history from Documentum. Migrating Documentum Audit Trail into Alfresco could potentially be very difficult and probably isn't recommended to put Documentum Audit Trail items directly into the Alfresco Audit Trail. A recommendation here would be to assess whether or not your existing Documentum Audit Trail is even being used and if it's needed. A lot of times Audit Trail items get created and nobody ever looks at them, and they actually end up clogging up your system because you can end up with, you know, millions of rows in a database, and that can really impact performance. So if you don't need your Audit Trail, then just leave it behind in Documentum. If that audit information is needed, then you can consider moving those Audit Trail items to a separate database table, or you can take that audit information and put it into a PDF document that you can append to the content that you're moving from Documentum, or you can attach it as a related item to the content within Alfresco. So quickly to touch on workflow, both Documentum and Alfresco include BPM engines as part of their full suite. There's no direct path for converting a Documentum workflow into an Alfresco activity workflow. Our recommendation here, again, planning is important. Identify any workflows that you're currently using in Documentum, and then develop activity templates within Alfresco to support those workflows. We also recommend that you finish any workflows that are currently running within Documentum prior to migrating into Alfresco. Once all of your content's moved to Alfresco, you can begin using the new activity workflows in Alfresco. Quick note on virtual documents. Alfresco does not natively support the concept of virtual documents like Documentum does. And actually our recommendation, even for our Documentum clients, is not to use virtual documents because they're not a standard ECM concept. If you are using virtual documents and migrating to Alfresco, we would recommend that you use relations or folders in order to represent those virtual documents. and implement them differently in Alfresco, or also consider leveraging XML or other standards-based concepts for document assembly. Quick note on users and groups as well. Migrate can extract users and groups from Documentum. And our recommendations here, similar to Documentum, Alfresco supports LDAP synchronization. Most of our clients on Documentum have our authentication working against an LDAP directory. Alfresco has the same concept, and rather than migrating all of your users and groups from Documentum, you can just set up a similar LDAP sync in Alfresco and run that synchronization. And then once your users and groups are created, you could also, as an alternative, if you need to get your groups out of Documentum, you can export those users and groups to a CSV file using Migrate. And Alfresco actually has a utility that will let you bulk import users and groups from a CSV file. So that's another alternative. And before I wrap up, I think Melissa said there's some questions out there.
Yes, there are. Our first question is, they've had some issues with migrating versions and repeating attributes. Is there anything you can talk about here? And then also, is a version label retained in the migration?
In our case, Migrate does support the migration of versions from Documentum. Speaking specifically for version labels, it really depends on if your version structure from Documentum is structured in a way that it's incremental. So if your version goes 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 2.0 with no spaces in between, that structure can be migrated into Alfresco. Where you run into problems is if you have gaps in your version structure in Documentum. Documentum will actually let you delete a previous version. So if your structure goes 1.1 to 1.3, that's a little bit more difficult to migrate into Alfresco. From a net metadata standpoint, our Migrate tool fully supports the migration of both single value and repeating attributes from Documentum to Alfresco, and that includes, string fields, date fields, anything really that you can throw at it, as long as you set up your content model correctly within Alfresco.
Okay, and then you said Migrate works with Documentum and Alfresco, but what other repositories can you use Migrate with?
If you look back at the slides after the presentation, I had a whole list of the source and target repositories very early on in the slides. Actually, let me roll back to those. So again, Migrate is useful. It can be used for more than just Documentum to Alfresco. There's a whole list of, let me back up here, of source repositories that we can migrate out of. There we go. So not just Documentum, Alfresco, but also FileNet, File System, Hummingbird. The list is here. So we have support for all of these. And if you have a homegrown repository that uses a database and file system, chances are we can fairly easily build a connector to migrate out of that and to move content into Alfresco.
Okay, great, thank you. And then last question is here. Someone just asked if we can send this presentation out later, and we will send it out so you can review it again or share with a colleague. I think that is it for the questions here, Tony.
All right.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Do you have anything else in closing?
I actually have just a couple more slides. I know we're probably running close on time.
Oh, okay.
So I've reviewed all the concepts in moving from Documentum to Alfresco. Real quickly, there are some huge opportunities that are presented if you are migrating out of a legacy Documentum system into Alfresco. A migration gives you the opportunity to modify and consolidate or expand your content model as necessary. For anyone who's worked in Documentum, it is very difficult to modify your content model in place. So migration presents you the opportunity to make changes as needed. Migration lets you change and reorganize your folder structure as you move from Documentum to Alfresco. You can simplify your security model and take advantage of security inheritance that's available in Alfresco. And finally, it allows you to clean up and leave any junk that exists in your Documentum repository behind. So migration, especially with Open Migrate, can happen only, you can move only the content that you need. If there's legacy content that's no longer being used, you can leave it behind. Final note, it's really important to consider your team as you're beginning to tackle a migration, whether it be from Documentum to Alfresco or really any system to Alfresco. Planning and testing can require a diverse amount of resources. On the Documentum side, you may not have the same team that you had when the system was built currently in place. You might not have the same knowledge of Documentum that existed initially. And on the Alfresco side, typically if you're migrating from Documentum to Alfresco, Alfresco might be new, so you might not have as many experts on the Alfresco side as you need to get through the full migration planning and execution. Similarly, if you're using Open Migrate as the migration tool to migrate from Documentum to Alfresco, you should definitely spend some time and have resources that are familiar with the Open Migrate tool. Migration is often a good opportunity to consider consultants because migrations are typically a one-time thing. You don't necessarily need to get all of your resources up to speed on Open Migrate and the migration process. And, if you're going to basically turn off Documentum and not do any more migrations after you're up and running on Alfresco. So in conclusion, migrating from Documentum to Alfresco doesn't have to be a daunting task if you plan appropriately. If you think back to my slide where the planning phase is the longest and most important phase of the migration, migration complexity can definitely vary greatly depending on the amount of content that you're migrating, the complexity of your content model and folder structure and security structure, and whether or not you're utilizing some of the additional artifacts in Documentum, including renditions, annotations, and workflow. So all of those items can add to the complexity and timeline of your migration. If you have any questions, you can visit our website to learn more about Open Migrate. We blog a lot about migrations on our blog at blog.tsgrp.com, and obviously feel free to send myself or Dave Giordano an email if you have additional questions. And I think that's it. Melissa, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony, again for the presentation. I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you for joining.